Hello, everybody, and welcome to our another episode of Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
Rupert, how are you today?
I'm great. I've got my curtains drawn because the sun is just streaming in, and the garden's all in great sunshine. But I realize I'm with someone from the Garden State and someone from what is it, Mark?
The Garden of England.
The Garden of England. So we've got the Garden State and the Garden of England all on this call at the same time
That is
when the sun is
amazing.
shining. So it's with great pleasure I can introduce Mark McAleer, who is strongly of Scottish descent. So we've worked out that our ancestors were bitter rivals about 800 years ago. So we have that in common.
They better not be watching this podcast.
Someone's watching from somewhere. And Mark is also, I've known Mark for quite a few years now, but it's rude to count. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rupert.
No, it's great to have you. And Mark, before we jump into all topics, org design and workforce planning and analytics, all that kind of good stuff, it'd just be great for the listeners to, apart from your Scottish ancestry, well, you could do that as well, but to know a bit about you.
Well, very briefly, I started once upon a time when I was younger. I decided I wanted to be an HR director. So I entered industry, and I've worked, I think I totted it, I've worked probably across 8 different sectors. So I started life in oil and gas, worked for a spell in FMCG, market research, and then ended up at BT Global Services. By that time, I decided that being an HR director probably wasn't for me. So I specialized in leadership development, talent development, OD, and change. And I decided to join BDO a couple of years ago to start their organizational solutions practice. And we have formed a great partnership with Orgvue. So that's me. I live with my wife in Kent, as we mentioned. We like to think of Kent as the Garden of England. So we bought a fixer-upper 10 years ago. And if you've ever restored a Grade 2 listed house, it never ends. So we think of ourselves as custodians rather than owners. And my passion, I don't think Rupert knows this, but my passion is I played rugby up to 37.
Wow.
Had to finally pack it in. So more of a supporter these days of England. And we'll talk about that another time, Rupert. But
yeah, definitely
my main passion in terms of sport.
So we have the same passion, which is rugby. We have the same ancestry, which is Scottish. And
Same also profession, which is org design.
Yeah, there we go.
This is fantastic. You guys have to make more for drinks and unpack that part. But Mark, welcome. And I'm very intrigued that you wanted to be an HR director when you wanted to grow up, but then you changed course and got into this amazing world of org design. And how was that journey? Because I'm always intrigued by people that how do they land in org design space? Not everybody gets exposure to it. And even if they do, not everybody stays in that space. So what kept you? What got you here and what kept you here?
Well, I think somebody once described careers as like being on a raft on a river, and it's whether you step onto the next raft going along. I was very, very fortunate early in my career in Amerada Hess. We were going through a major transformation. We were working with Gemini Consulting back then, and I was asked to join that transformation program. So I was really lucky. I got early exposure to transformation work, consulting toolkit. So it was like sort of a year's worth of intensive development. I had some amazing mentors back in the day. A guy called Charles Donahue. I also worked with a fantastic guy called Ken Adeas, who was an amazing mentor to me. And they were the ones who sparked my interest in this whole field of learning and development, leadership development. and they encouraged me to study for a master's degree. So I actually did an MPhil in sort of organizational development, leadership development. And if you're familiar with action learning, it was actually an action learning based MPhil. So it was very, very unusual in that it combined the academic side with the action learning side of actually getting some stuff done in the organization.
Very cool. And then you never left the space.
I was on a different path, Shradha. By then, I was on a different path. So all my kind of initial aspirations to be an HR director went out of the window. So I kind of went down the path of learning, and I almost think of it as building blocks, and it'll be relevant to probably what we get onto. So I started very much in training and development, the real basics of how do you design training and development, and then as I got more experience, I entered into leadership development. And I suppose a real pivotal role was joining BT Global Services. And I was really fortunate to be head of leadership development, talent, and graduate development. And that was a very fast paced environment going through huge amounts of change. So I had a CEO who once coined the phrase ugly learning. And I think that's a good way of describing those years. It was
What does that mean, active learning? Could you unpack that for us?
I think it I guess for me, Rupert, what it means is that if you're steady state, business as usual, coming in and sort of managing the work, yeah, you can learn. You can always learn from experience. But if all you're doing is repeating the same experience, it feels like you're moving at a certain pace. But when you're coming in every day and you're being presented with new challenges, new conundrums, new puzzles, I think that really accelerates your learning, as well as your personal resilience as well.
And it's all really hard. And that's why it's ugly.
It's hard. I mean, I think you have to. I think one thing I've learned in life is one of the great people I worked for was a woman called Frances Alcock, and she always kept us on an even keel. And she would always say under moments of stress, if you think what we do is really important, remember we are not doctors and nurses. We don't hold people's lives in our hands. So if you're getting stressed, just bear that in mind.
Relativize.
Exactly.
Yeah. Although I often say actually that when you're doing OD work, the implications of the work have such a profound impact on people's lives. It is actually more serious because, there are lots of times when if someone's made redundant in a bad way or let go or not dealt with properly or the role's not designed for them, the stress that's created can cause huge harm to the point where actually, and I when I speak at conferences, I talk about this quite a bit and I call them horror stories.
Mm.
And the number of times I've heard of people who've committed suicide, people who have actually committed murder on the back of the work that we do, if you do it badly. So I guess I'm going to push back a little bit against the advice that, a lot of work that people do isn't doctors and nurses, but actually the work you do as an OD professional, if you do it badly, can actually have really detrimental consequences.
No, I agree, Rupert, and I wasn't meaning to be flippant. I think when it comes to any kind of restructuring or separation process or redundancy, I guess it says a lot about the organisation and how that's done. When I worked with Coca-Cola, they had a maxim which has always stuck with me of TTT, tell the truth. Now, sometimes in a restructuring or redundancy program, there's kind of waves of information you can share. But I think remembering that there's humans at the center of change and the values of your organization and how you treat people, I think I absolutely agree with you, Rupert. I've seen organizations do it brilliantly well, where people leave and they still feel very positive about the organization they've had the privilege of working for. They feel very positive about their colleagues and what have you. But unfortunately, all too often, I've seen the other end of the spectrum where people have been treated quite frankly, quite shoddily.
Yeah. Mark, and that is exactly the reality, right? Like we get the full spectrum of this work where things are really done well and become the business case, like the case studies of how things go wrong, how things go well, and then there are case studies of how things go wrong. So, in your thought process, like are some of the key elements that help us in that spectrum? Like what makes us things go well versus what makes us things not go so well?
I think the more I work with organisations and senior stakeholders, I'm reminded, and I can't think of the author, so it may have been Beckhart, it may have been one of the OD thinkers. This notion of the Alberline paradox, and what I mean by that is, all too often as change practitioners, OD practitioners, we're often brought in not at the beginning. So often it's we've tried this ourselves, or we can't quite work out what's going on. So to answer your question, I think getting with stakeholders absolutely crystal clear understanding of where they want to go and the outcomes they want to achieve. I think where I've kind of fallen foul is where you have a top team or a group of leaders, and you think they have a shared understanding of where they're going, and you think they're speaking the same language, and you think that they're sort of broadly aligned. And when things go awry, it's usually because they had different understandings of what was meant and where they were thinking they were heading.
And or they were just prioritizing different things and not willing to confront that conflict.
Yeah, I think you're right, and underestimating. I think sometimes. I mean, we all do it: time, cost, and quality. And sometimes if you're trapped in that escape room, you're sort of looking at those three levers, going, well, one of these has got to work. And often there's an underestimation of what it takes. And the other kind of symptom I've seen, which is, I'm sure you've come across this, Rupert, is if I've had a penny for every time I've heard the phrase, well, this person double hats or triple hats, because they're a senior executive, they're amazing. Really, it doesn't matter how amazing you are. We all have 24 hours in the day. So I've seen it so many times where an organization will say, let's put this person in charge of this piece of transformation work because they're so good at this role and they're so good at that role. Surely they can do this one on top. That's usually where organizations unwittingly break people, particularly their talented people.
Yeah, find the busiest person and then give them more work to do.
Yeah.
Up to a point that works, and then it breaks. That's an interesting, and I think for our listeners, it'd be useful just to talk through an example of where you arrived, where you're in a situation that was going awry, and it was like a horror story. It was just a disaster or a mild disaster, because I think we learn more from errors than from successes. Just to kind of not obviously hiding who it was, but
yeah, I won't name names in terms of organisations, but I did arrive in a transformation where there was quite a high drive to strip out cost. There was quite a high drive to simplify the hierarchy, if you like, and simplify banding from classic sort of A, B, C, D. And this work was well underway. However, the target operating model was literally sketched out on a piece of paper, and nobody had really given thought to the bigger picture target operating model. The best analogy I can use, and forgive me, it's a poor analogy, but I like it. If you've ever played Jenga and you start pulling out pieces, then everything's fine. You can keep whacking out pieces, and the tower is still standing, but you just pull out one more piece and the whole tower can go crashing over. And this was what was happening in this organization.
I love that analogy, actually.
Oh, thank you.
right? And then we blame that one particular piece that because
Correct.
of that it happened.
Yeah.
Right. I love that. I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what happens without that clear target operating model. And to give you a sort of example, and Rupert, I'm sure you've seen this countless times. People then they go to the micro design and they get obsessed with spans of control, and you get sometimes these ludicrous conversations, right, where it has to be 8, right, but there are only 5 people in the team. No, but it has to be 8. Okay, so you want to hire 3 more. So I exaggerate to make it quick, but you do
Yeah.
get some quite ludicrous obsessions with the answer's 8. I don't care how you get to it, make it 8.
Yeah.
And this was the same
It's
organization itself in a knot.
So they were doing that as well. I mean, I see that just way too often, and too often it's driven actually by management consultants because it's
Yeah.
very easy to quantify, and a span of control of 1 can make perfect sense. Because
Totally.
what proportion of time you might be, a player coach, right? And you've got a lot of accountability and a lot of work that you're doing. And you've got one person who's working alongside you, it's totally fine. I've seen organizations, Mark, that have 2 organizational structures. So there's the official one that's in the system, and then there's the real one. And so you have people officially reporting just so they can get to the magic number, so they're not a threat. So then the report that goes up to the board and to the exco, it's all clean.
Yes.
And it's like, but they're not actually reporting to those people at all. They're not even doing any work together.
Yes.
It's just for that, just to protect their jobs.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you another example. Another organization I worked in, they got to a point, it was a manufacturing organization. They got to a point where they said every shift supervisor in a factory needed to have 30 direct reports to lead a shift team. So the magic number in this case became 30. And then I was brought in, we were talking about leadership development, and the challenge became, the trouble with these supervisors, they're not spending enough time coaching, developing. They're not walking the production line. So that's interesting. So long story short, it became not a program of leadership development. It became a program of what is in the environment around that supervisor that is keeping them locked in their office during a shift versus getting out, interacting with people, coaching them. Because what people didn't realize is that they thought that the shift supervisor was completing 1 report. But what we found out was that actually 6 different departments were asking the shift supervisor to complete 6 different reports whilst he or she was leading a shift. So we pretty soon concluded it was the way the work had been set up, not the reluctance of the supervisor to invest time in coaching and supporting their team.
I love this example in so many ways, Mark. And I would like to go a little bit deeper on it because that was my next question coming to you. Very often we are brought in as a training need or a training problem or a leadership development problem. But practitioners like you who think about organization as a system then understand that it's not a training need or a leadership development need, but it's actually a work design need. And we need to think about the system holistically, design it well, because otherwise, whatever we put is just chewing gums and band aids. It's not going to actually make it work. So I love that example and how you unpack that. What I would like to understand more from you is that how do you bring stakeholders along in that? Because they sometimes, when the management consultants are brought in or any other like practitioner is brought in, they're like, no, only solve this problem for me. There is a mathematical problem. I need to take a cost out. Just solve that for me. Rest everything, I don't care. How do we actually now influence the stakeholders to think differently like us?
That's a great question, and a couple of things come to mind. I have a mantra which I picked up years ago, which is there's no point putting a changed leader back inside an unchanged system. which I guess is what you're talking about. It's one of my go-to mantras. And I was, funny enough, talking to a fantastic OD practitioner. Pains me to say it, Rupert, another fellow Kiwi, fantastic former colleague called Anne Braithwaite. And I'll answer your question, but we're having this, we caught up over lunch and we were having this amazing conversation about the frozen middle. And how often have we heard that, where senior leadership will say, we could improve customer service, we could optimize performance if only the frozen middle would budge. And to your point, you often then get this edict of, well, go and design a program, a leadership to program that will get the frozen middle to unfreeze and do the right stuff. So one of the ways I've done this in the past, which worked, and this was in a big complex organization, we were told we need to design a program for frontline leaders. And I was working with, I brought in an old mentor of mine who's sadly no longer with us, a great guy called Bill Laidlaw. We thought, how can we turn this on its head? So we did a couple of things that really got our stakeholders, if I can use a technical term, angsty. We said, what if we actually asked the pilot groups of leaders, there was about 50 of them across the organization, what if we actually asked them what they need? And our stakeholders went, but don't you just design the modules and just roll it out? We went, well, why don't we ask them what their problems are, what their challenges are in managing people, and we'll co-design the modules with them to give them what they need. Oh, that's novel. We then rolled in an element of 360 so they could have some behavioral feedback. We also used action learning, but we didn't call it action learning. We called it kind of business challenges, business problems. And a couple of really interesting things happened. My colleagues in HR weren't very happy because they felt that first line leaders shouldn't really be designing this stuff, but we got over that. But a really funny thing happened in the system. The managers of the frontline leaders, if you like, started to get a bit nervous. So we ran these things called three-way meetings. So basically what we did is we sat down and facilitated a conversation between the frontline leader and his or her manager so that we could have clear learning goals, clear expectations, work to treat. But the thing we hadn't anticipated was that the managers of the frontline leaders started feeling a bit left out, and they started to sort of say, well, what are these guys getting? Basically what they were saying that we never got. So we actually had to then run another program, like a sort of cheat sheet version of what the frontline leaders were getting for the leaders. So it was a way of, it was a very neat example of how we were meeting the need of the ask in running a leadership development program, but doing it in a way that brought about some systemic change.
And what were some of the surprising things they asked for that you wouldn't have, if you can remember?
I can, Rupert. The one that really kind of, should we say, triggered some of my colleagues is that they were asking for some stuff around how you think about strategy and change. And there was this kind of view of, well, they're frontline leaders. They don't do strategy and they don't do change. And we had to sort of say, well, you know, they are actually being tasked with leading quite significant transformations in their respective teams. So we've got to equip them with the tools and the methods for doing that. And then fast forward towards the end, there was quite a major restructuring across that division, and the senior players, sort of VPs and above, were really surprised because we almost had a control group. We had people who'd been through the program. I think by the end we put about 150, 200 people through, and the other half of the division hadn't gone through it. And when it came to the quite significant transformation, the group who'd been through the program actually took the initiative, worked collaboratively, both across boundaries, but also across locations. We had these people in 3 locations across the UK. Whereas the group that hadn't had the investment, their immediate reaction was sort of paralysis and look up. Tell us what's going on.
Tell us what to do.
Tell us what to do.
Out of interest, I'm just wondering what kind of scale of investment per person. So how much classroom time? What was the elapsed time of the training? Just a sense of scale.
Sense of
the
scale.
investment.
I can't remember the investment. It was quite a significant investment, but the way we did it,
in terms of time,
Rupert, it was over a 6 to 8 month period, and we had 6 modules. But the trick was the magic happened, if you like, between the modules.
Sure.
Because that was where each person had a personal set of goals, but also their own project.
Yeah. And that's the action learning bit. So,
correct.
So let's say it was 8-9 months, 6 modules. So every sort of month-ish, is that a classroom setting? So you physically.
It was a hit of 1-2 days maximum in terms of the module, and then in between,
module, in a room, and then in between
it was all about action, and each set, each business set had a facilitator. So, but they would drive when they would meet and how they would meet, and they would come together. And I don't want to paint a sort of overly rosy picture. If you had different sets, some really came together and motored, others okay, and some just didn't gel. But the point was each one had facilitation support.
Right.
And at the end of the program,
learning from each other as anything else.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And what it started to do, which was, and what it was great is it built that sort of collaboration across boundaries, which I'm a huge fan
and
of.
building relationships.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, because I think how I'm thinking about it is that, even if we are practitioners in different parts of the organization, that HR organization, if we start thinking about system as a whole, an organization as a system, then we are able to break the silos across the organization and make it more effective. So you need not be an org design practitioner to do org design. You actually can come from learning lens, can come from workforce planning lens, and think about organization holistically to be able to create effectiveness in the organization. So I have one more question for you, Mark, is that when was the point of inflection when you felt that you need platforms or more stronger tools in order to do org design? That many a times what happens is that we are able to do the systemic things, but like I think Rupert, that's where you were going, that it starts to max out at a scale. You can only do as much. So when did that happen that you felt that you need a platform now to do org design?
That's a great question. I think if I think back in my career in the organizations I've worked in, organizations, if they get to a certain scale, are pretty good at doing recruitment. It's pretty slick. We could debate the merits of online systems and how they treat candidates, but pretty much most organizations, that kind of in-flight, in-year replacement of attrition, filling new positions, people are pretty good at that. I think most organizations do that fairly well. In most of the organizations I've worked in, when you mention the words strategic workforce planning, you get lots of people nodding sagely in a meeting saying, we'll do that. Yeah, we'll do that. And I suppose my inflection point was I've never seen it done well. Never seen it done well because people are so busy, if you like, filling this year's requirements to budget and managing attrition. Nobody really has time to look at the future shape of the organization, both in terms of its org design, both in terms of its workforce and its skills. And I think for me that was kind of the inflection point of saying, actually, there's got to be a far, far smarter way of doing that. And then, of course, I read Rupert's books, and the rest is
We all
history.
became intelligent after that. That is
Well, I have
how.
to say, and Rupert will blush, but I was reading his books, and sometimes, apart from the great insights and learning that he shares in his writing, I'd be like going, "That's the framework I use," you know. And so I was sometimes smiling reading bits because I was thinking, yes. And I think what Rupert has brought for me personally is the missing bits of the puzzle, because I've grown up through the learning route, the leadership development route, the OD route. Um, and if you're not careful, OD can end up being very ethereal and meaningless to senior stakeholders. So can I go, not another culture conversation, not more on values. And I think what Orgvue brings and the discipline of data-led approach is a discipline that, and my favorite model of all time is the organizational planning analysis. That is my kind of go-to thinking, because it kind of mirrors the FP&A language that finance uses, and I'll be honest, I still think this is a hugely untapped area for progressive HR functions. That if they can take FP&A and bring the discipline of OP&A to FP&A, then that's really beyond interesting. It's hugely valuable and useful.
100%.
Thank you, Mark. You're too kind, and couldn't agree more, obviously. And why is it you? I mean, maybe it's finding the busy people and the people who are doing the talent acquisition, and then trying to get them to do the OP&A work. That's part of my hypothesis, that you're putting the wrong people in the seats. But what's your view as to why the majority of organizations aren't doing this and not doing it well?
I think it was Peter Drucker who said many years ago, an organization gets the HR function it deserves. So I think all too often I hear, well, we've got to have a seat at the top table. We need this seat. We need to earn the right. And I think what happens, wrongly or rightly, HR gets called upon to do all sorts of stuff that perhaps it shouldn't be doing, or should be outsourcing. I mean, a good example being, I don't want to get into COVID, but I had colleagues, people I knew, who were first-class HR directors, but they were being practically running the COVID, pandemic, setting up remote working, logistics teams. They became quasi facilities managers, quasi HR, IT directors. So I think sometimes HR gets distracted by fads. So analytics, I'll use this facetiously, but to make the point, I've been in one client where they invested massively in HR analytics, and they were producing these amazing infographics and bar charts and percentages. And one of them was turnover. And it was like, well, we can tell you 46 reasons why somebody is leaving the organization. And I was like, that falls into the category of interesting, but it's not useful. You're not telling me anything that is root cause, or you're not telling me what that actually means for the workforce or the future. So it's a long-winded way of answering the question. I think sometimes the resources and the roles are probably pointed at the wrong stuff. And that doesn't mean that HR functions don't have some super capable people, but it's almost like saying, if we really want that voice at the top table and we really want to demonstrate our value, we should be focusing where we can add the most value in terms of the strategic conversation. And to me, I'm unbiased, I think that's the OP&A space.
Unfortunately, the time's always Morpheus said in the Matrix, time's always against us. So to wrap up, one tool, one thing that you think would be helpful for our listeners to pick up on, and one trap to try and avoid. You've mentioned quite a few traps, by the way. Try and pick one.
In terms of tool, one of the things, apart from using Orgvue, but one of the things we're starting to experiment with is looking at the potential of organizational network analysis. We talked earlier about the formal versus the informal organization. And I'm almost seeing as this there's the yin to the yang of Orgvue. I think there's a lot of untapped potential, particularly as organizations get flatter and more complex. I think that has great potential. So that's something we're looking at. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's something we're paying a lot of attention to.
Yeah. And a trap?
I'd come back to, and I haven't mentioned ERP specifically, but if I think of organizations that end up in severe pain, and pain both in terms of money, damage to customers, and I would say organizations undertaking big ERP projects. So my kind of trap is, don't embark on a major ERP program without seriously understanding the org design and skill implications. Because I've worked on a big ERP program, and the UX, UI, focus on the individual goes out the window after about 6 months. So unless that's front and center, unless the human side of change is front and center of your ERP, my advice would be go back, get that in at the beginning, or as we all know in change management, there's a great adage, you pay now or you pay later.
That's nice. That's a great way to end. Mark, thank you so much.
It was fantastic, Mark, to hear your stories and your insights. I learned so much. So thank you for
Thank you both.
being
It's
here
been a
and
real
sharing.
pleasure. Been a real pleasure. To a fellow Scot.
Likewise.
Yeah.
And garden fellow, right?
Garden fellow.
Thank you, Shradha.
Thanks.
Cheers, everyone. Until next time.
Until next time, Rupert. Bye now.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.